kashim with chamitferia, and then Ramor sticks in the ein magilim b'shum mashke rak b'mayim. You can't kasher with any liquid other than water. Mi b'diavad mahani hagol b'chol mashke, but b'diavad you could use any mashke, even if it's not water. And then the Ramor sticks in a related din, which is a magal harbi kelim b'yera. If you kasher a lot of kelim in one pot, ad shemiroy pleitas hakelim now shamayim ketir, that because so many pleitas come out of it, that the water gets thick, like a sear, like all those blades are coming out. So you can't use that water anymore, because then that water is not plain water anymore. Just like at the beginning of the din he said that you can only kasher with plain water. So too, if all the blades come out, change the appearance of the water, then you can't kasher with that water, which is a halacha that I suspect we will never have. Except, I remember there was once a person who kashered, and they would find when they kashered a certain tank, they always had these white things floating around in the water, and for the life of them, they could not figure out what it was. They cleaned it, scrubbed it, perfectly clean. Everybody thought that, hey, if this stuff is in it, it must not be clean, but for the life of them, they could not figure out what it was. They had all kinds of theories about water and scale, and all kinds of theories about what was going on, but no one ever got to the bottom of that. Okay, let's go to what the Ramah really said. Okay,
they have them, I guess, by Kashrus and wooden things.
This was some wood. Oh, I mean, if you would have this thing, that things would be left.
I can metal can clean. Don't come out, but other types of.
Right. Okay. Well, of course. I mean, you say it's not clean, but of course, really there are bleeds coming out, and the bleeds are going to cloud the door. That's what Ramos talking about, right? So whatever that means, who knows? Okay. Our din, this whole din is based on what I think we've talked about this before. I think is the most simple or most fundamental question is about Hagol's Kilim, which is if you kasher a kli, the bleeds come out. Well, if the blades come out, they should turn around and go right back into the kli. Okay, that's the simplest, the most fundamental question we have about Hagol's Kilim. And we know we have all kinds of answers, but each one of them has their weakness to it. The answer that we use the best is we say, okay, well, kasher and say the binyomi. Okay, which is a fine answer, because it lets you kasher, and the water is not shaved. But of course, it doesn't explain the din, because mid-deraisa, kilim that ain't binyomi, don't have to be kasher altogether. So it can't be that you only can kasher things in their ben yomi, because midaraisa that makes no sense. So the din, that doesn't explain the din. That helps us work with the din. That doesn't explain the din. And the other big answer, which is that the shishim in the water connected the bleeds that come out, means that you can only kasher kalim that are small. You can't kasher big kalim. Once the kalim gets too big, you can't put it into a pot that's shishim connected, or you can't kasher 100 pieces of silver at once. Okay, so you run out of. It makes it difficult to kasher, which is a teichik, because the Torah, you just get the impression, you just kasher all the things. You don't get the impression that there's these restrictions on it. It should say something like that, okay? The only way sort of to get out of that is to say is that we say that the kli has a blia connected its full thickness. I have a knife. I assume that the full thickness of the knife has a blia. That's a chumrah. It's because we don't know how much blia came out. Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu knew how much bleed came out of it, so for him it was easy to have shishim connected. Okay, good. And there are other answers that we don't really like, or they have their own chukim, like we say is you have to put the bleed in for just a amount of time till the bleed comes out, or you have to have the water boiling at a full boil the whole time. All kinds of answers like that. Okay, so the Ramban answers this kasha with a completely different answer, and the Ramban's answer is like this. He says that water and other liquids have exactly the opposite properties of one another. Water draws blias out of a kli, but doesn't put blias into a kli. And other liquids put blias into a kli, but don't take blias out of a kli. Okay, water and liquids have completely opposite properties of each other. So when I when I cook up a pot with apple juice, a pot of soup, so those blias go from the chicken into the kli. When I want to kasher that kli, I kasher it with water. The blias of the chicken soup come out of the kli into the water, but those blias do not go back into the kli. They can't go back in. So you can kasher with benyamin.
Chicken soup is ice water.
What?
Chicken soup is ice. It's no longer water.
We'll get to, that's a kasher. Go 1 second for that question. But I'm going to say what he says first. Okay? What he says is that when the blia, I was trying to not give an example. If I cooked up treifa tomato sauce, okay, the blia goes in.
You don't usually have treifa water.
The blia goes in. No, but the point is that you do have shaved water when you kasher a kli. The water is shaved. The Ramban says the blias that get absorbed into the water, but those blias cannot turn around and go back into the kli. Those blias that were drawn into the water.
Why can't those blias go back in?
Because water only draws blias out. Water doesn't push blias in.
Water. That's chicken soup blias.
Hold that question for a second. Before you get to the details, just the theory of what he's answering is Hagolah water draws blias out and can't push it back in. And other liquids can push things in, but they can't pull them out. Okay, so the two things are complete opposites of each other. And the Mela, you could kasher because big deal. Take the clay, stick it into the water, the blias will go into the water. They never turn around and come back in. That's what the Ramban. That's what he says. Okay. So now, the Ramban has rice. We're going to mention one of them in a second. He has, aside from he's not just saying this to answer the kasha. He has some rice to it that water and liquids have different properties from one another. Okay, so the Rajva, in the Teres Bayis and in the Tshuva, says that he went to the Ramban, and if I remember correctly, the words are Asti Ponai to ask Kashrus to the Ramban about the shita. Okay, he went to the Ramban and he asked him a whole bunch of questions. Okay, we're going to mention a couple of them that he answered. So we asked. I believe that the Raj was a Talmud of the Ramban, but the way it's written makes it sound like the Ramban was much older than he was. He was asking like as in he was like a 20-year-old asking the Rosh Yeshiva a question. That's the impression you get. Okay, anyhow, so he says, so he asked the Ramban. He says, according to you, if I cook a piece of nevela in a pot, if I make chicken soup, he says, why doesn't the pot stay kosher? Because the bliya has to go through the water to get into the kli. Water can't put bliyas into the kli. You're telling me water, bliyas, things that are in water don't get into the kli. So here I'm cooking chicken soup with a tray of chicken. So the bliya from the chicken goes into the water. You're telling me bliyas can't get from water into a kli. So the Ramban said, no, because there the water can't put bliyas in, but the chicken goes from itself, so to speak, through the water and right into the kli itself. So the nevela from the chicken goes right. Nevela straight from chicken into the kli, and the water doesn't have anything to do with it. It goes like straight. So the Rajva said, good. So then you missed your whole point, because you're saying when you do Hagolah, the bliya comes out. So the bliya comes out, and the bliya will go itself back into the kli. If you say there could be such a thing, that the bliya can make its way without the water and get into the kli, so the bliya that comes out of the kli is no different than the bliya that comes out of the chicken. What's the difference? So to that, the Ramban said back to him that there's a difference, that the bliya that comes out of a kli is weaker, and sort of like we say, he didn't use these words, but like we say, not barna. The bliya that comes out of a kli is weaker than a regular bliya, so it becomes part of water, and water can't push bliyas back in. But the bliya that comes out of the actual chicken itself, that's a stronger bliya, and it could make its way right into the kli without having to sort of deal with the water. That's the Ramban and the Rajva had a back and forth. If I remember, in one of the places. If I remember in the Tshuva, the Rajva said that the Ramban didn't have an answer to the question. Okay, like he was just left with that question. Okay, but in the Teres Bayis, he says this is what the Ramban, they went back and forth about this. Okay, now, there should be an opposite question also, which she doesn't say. Maybe I'm missing something here. I don't know if this point is crucial, but there's an opposite question. What happens if I cook tomato sauce? Cook tomato sauce in a trefa pot? If liquids other than water don't draw bliyas out of a kli, so my tomato sauce should stay kosher. Because if other Sha'ar Mashkim can only push bliyas in, and water can only push bliyas out, so when I cook my tomato sauce in a trefa pot, why am I saying it stays kosher? Because it doesn't bring any bliyas out. Because if I cook chicken soup in the trefa pot, so then the water will take bliyas in, so it'll absorb bliyas. But what happens if I cook something that doesn't have water? I cook a piece of meat on there. I use a trefa clean, I just put something else on there. So the Ramban is saying, he said Sha'ar Mashkim, I shouldn't say piece of meat, he said Sha'ar Mashkim. So if I put tomato sauce into there, if I put apple juice into the kli, so why don't I say it can't draw the bliyas out?
The ikka question that Ramban has to answer is, why does Hagolah work?
Correct.
Okay, that the other things can't draw it out.
What's the problem?
So I mean I'm not even sure why he has to.
Why does he have to say that?
Yeah.
So in Cheshbon, why does he have to? So it has to do with his diukim from. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You're right. That part. That's what I think. It's not crucial. That's what we're saying. The Ramban does say. I don't remember how it fits in Cheshbon. You're saying is that it's the important parts here that Sha'ar Mashkim can push bliyas in, Hagolah water can take bliyas out, Hagolah water can't put bliyas in. The fact that Sha'ar Mashkim can't take bliyas out, that's not so crucial. Okay, I'm going to mention to you a right in a second, from which the Ramban has a right as part of the whole cheshbon. It's not needed, but it's part of his rights. Okay.
Besides that, to answer your question, the chayra, all you need to say is that Sha'ar Mashkim don't have the koyach to vaday take everything out.
Okay.
Koyach of Hagolah to take everything out, but it could.
So it's not a vaday. It's a possibility. Maybe it does. It's not. You can't be confident that it's going to, but it might be that it's going to. Okay, fine. Okay. Now, the Ramban asked the Rajva, he said to him, he says, well, if you tell me that we mentioned this question. If you tell me that you always need shishim in the water connected to the kli, he said, how did they kasher claim bidyan? He says, maybe there were big kalim claim bidyan. So how would they kasher those kalim? So the Ramban we mentioned, is answering that question. And he asked Rajba another question. He said to me, and also he said,
what's his question? How did
they kasher big kalim? If you have to have shishim connected,
that means the Ramban is the Rajba.
He is back to the Rajba. He says, so if your pot is this big, you have to have a pot that's even bigger than it to kasher it in, which doesn't. It's not. I mean, eventually the kli gets too big. It doesn't work. I mean, you can't get another kli that's bigger, that's big enough to be shishim connected. And he says, and also he says, how do you know? How did the Yid know that the goyim had never used their pots to cook up water that had been used for avodah zarah? Avodah zarah is not part of the shishim. So how do they know that they never use it? What?
It's not deraisa.
That avodah zarah is not b'shishim?
Yeah, there's no such thing as no mitzvah deraisa.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay, that's a good point. The Ramban asked him the kasha. He said, how do they know they didn't use things like that? So okay, it's a good question. So I don't know. So anyhow, so the Rashba said to the first kasha he said is maybe they didn't kasha big hill. Maybe they didn't kasha. Now for us we'd be like, how could they not kasha them? The truth is, on the rice level, it's not such a big deal. You just do it till tomorrow, right? This clay he can't kasha. What do we say?
Kasha because they turn on the challah.
Right, okay, fine. Okay, so the Rashba said no. So they didn't kasha those kalim. He doesn't say this, but I'm saying so they wait till tomorrow. Like big deal. Like, what's the big? Like, we tell people you can't kasha, have to throw it out. They said can't kasha. Wait till tomorrow. Okay. And the other thing he says is you don't have to be cautious for things that they used it for water that was up with Zara. It's already like far fetched. Don't worry about it. Okay. Now the Ramban brings a riot to his way of looking at things. And this has to do with what you said, Yossi, which is the Gemara. The Gemara says that there's the pasuk before the Gemara. There's a pasuk that says that there's a mitzvah of mariko shtifa. When you use a kli for the pasuk talking about a chatas, and the Gemara talks about the other kabanos. So let's say for a chatas, you use a kli for a chatas. Chatas has to be in had l'yom v'layla. So when the yom v'layla ends, it becomes noiser. So now you have bliyas of noiser inside of your kli that you had used to cook up the chatas. So the Torah says that if you have such a kli, umorak v'shutaf b'mayim. Okay, you have to do something. You have to do what we call mariko shtifa to the kli. Okay, and so machlokes there in the Gemara in Zvachim as to what mariko shtifa means. Okay, but the Gemara says that the pasuk it's really a Torah's koinim that says umorak v'shutaf b'mayim, and b'mayim teaches us that you have to do mariko shtifa with mayim, but you can't do mariko shtifa with wine. And the Gemara says b'mayim I feel you can't even use b'mosuk. I mean, even if you take wine and you water it down the way they used to drink it, even if you have watered down wine, which is mainly water, right? The thing that you've done is mainly water. You still can't use that from mariko shtifa. You have to use mamish mayim. Umorak v'shutaf b'mayim, only b'mayim, no other liquids. You can't use other things. Even mosuk, the Gemara says, even watered down wine. Okay. So the Raman says, you see from here that other liquids cannot be used for hagala. Water and other liquids are different from each other. Water draws bliyas out, and other things do not. Okay, he's with an assumption that mariko shtifa is to take out the bliyas. He says so the other liquids don't take it out. That's what he brought as a riot to his shita, and to which the Rashba says, do you think that's a riot to you? It's a riot to me. He says because if you look at the Gemara says umarik v'shutaf b'mayim, that by touching by this din of mariko shtifa, it's a special din that you have to do b'mayim and not other mashkin. And the Gemara says the fair is, but if you have other bliyas like truma, other bliyas that are in the kli that have to be kashrus from, then there's no din of b'mayim. The din of b'mayim is special for chatas or karbonis, but for other din it doesn't apply. So he says, don't forget, the Gemara is saying that you can use Sha'ar Mashkim to do a kol. But you're telling me the Gemara says not to, and he says no, forget it's right, not like that. And the Ramban's answer to that kasha, the Ramban, when the Rashba doesn't bring an answer for the Ramban to that kasha. Okay, but in the Sefer of the Ramban himself in Chulin says that he gives an answer which I don't know what it means. I mean, because it doesn't read in our Gemara an answer about how that Gemara is the Gemara is going according to Abaye, and we hold like Rava and L'Chayra, the way we have our Gemara. Unless I'm missing something, I am missing something because the Gemara sure seems to be saying that in Rava, not in Abaye. And the Ramban says it's only Abaye, not in Rava. Okay, so anyhow, we have this machlokes, the Ramban and the Rashba. The Ramban says Hagala can only be done with water, not with any other mashkin, not even diluted of other liquids. And the Rashba says that you could do Hagala with all kinds of liquids. Okay, as you can imagine, the Shesha brings both days, and the Mechaber says nothing about it. Okay, the Mechaber is completely silent about this thing because he passes like the Rashba. You can do Hagala with any mashkin that you want to. So he doesn't even, I don't know why, he doesn't even mention the whole thing at all together. The Mechaber brings the other din about Chami Tveria, but which is from an Orchos Chaim, But this din that he brought, which has to do with whether you can do Sha'ar Mashkim, he doesn't mention it b'chlal. It's completely not in the Mechaber. The Ramah says the Ikar Hadin is like the Ramban. I'm sorry, it's like the Rajba that you can kasher with Sha'ar Mashkim. But we're machmir for the sheet of the Ramban to say that you can't kasher with Sha'ar Mashkim. Okay? Now, you have to just remember that the Ramah is saying a chumrah to be machmir for the Ramban, but the Ramban's main point was not a chumrah. The Ramban's main point was a kula. The Ramban was trying to say that you could kasher a kli which is ben yoimai without shishim, without anything. Any kli you want, you can kasher because the hagolah water takes the bleeds in and doesn't give them back. The Ramban really meant the kula. Okay, so no one's dreaming of saying like the kula. I mean, we've seen it enough times. No one's dreaming of saying like the kula of the Ramban. We're only saying the chumrah. It should be choshesh and not be kasher with Sha'ar Mashkim. Okay, now the Ramah says that you could only be samech on hagolah b'Sha'ar Mashkim b'di'evet. Okay, that's what he says. Okay, what does it mean when he says that it's b'di'evet? You could be samech on. What does that mean b'di'evet? So the Pri Megadim has two cases. One is simple. You already made food on it. You kasher the pot with Sha'ar Mashkim, and then you made food on it. And yet another example is that you kasher the pot before Pesach with Sha'ar Mashkim. On Pesach, you realize that you made a mistake. You did use Sha'ar Mashkim. So he says, so now on Pesach you're not allowed to kasher. You're not allowed to do hagol. You're not allowed to do hagol on Pesach. So since you can't do hagol on Pesach, so that's b'di'evet, and that you can't. You're stuck. You have no choices for making a new hagol. So that's also considered b'di'evet, and you could use the pot for the rest of Pesach. I mean, you could use the pot for the rest of Pesach. Okay. Another example is the regular rule we say shas al chak b'di'evet dami. Okay, and that's a Rikveger who says in the tshuva that you could do shas al chak b'di'evet dami for this also. Okay, but just to contrast what it means shas al chak b'di'evet for this din is Rikveger's case is the case that he's talking about that he says yeah you could do shas al chak b'di'evet is Yidden. I don't exactly get the story. They were locked in someplace, and they had the only pot that they had was a treifa pot, and they had no water. They only had milk, and they were locked in overnight. So then they said, Shas Chakadiyava, they kashered with milk, and then they used the pot to cook something milk. Okay, then they used the pot to cook something else. Okay, so that's his example. He says, yeah, Taka, that was good that you did that, because that was Shas Chakadiyava dummy. Rabbi Trager was not locked up, but they wrote him afterwards asking whether they thought it was a good idea. Okay, to contrast that, Rabbi Shechter likes to show, it's not exactly talking about this case, but it's almost, that Dayan Weiss, the Minchas Yitzchak, Dayan Weiss he says the people who want to have parava ice cream that they can eat at a fleshig meal is not considered shasal chakadiyavadim. If you think that it's so important that we should have ice cream that's parav, that's not considered shasal. He's not exactly talking about our case, but Rabbi Shechter like to mention it. When you're He's not exactly talking about hagol b'Sha'ar Mashkim. Whatever he's talking about a similar kind of a thing, but he says that's not considered shasal chakadiyavadim. Shasal chak to have parav ice cream, that's not a shasal chak.
That parav ice cream refers to matlach hatzil.
Okay, so you don't have to, but okay. Then it might be matlach hatzil anyhow, but okay. He's talking about whether you should do that as a hagol. Okay, Rabbi first doesn't say you should. Hashgacha should do that. He's talking about whether the consumers can eat it. Okay, anyway. Okay, now also. It's also worth noting, this is not a case of B'di'evet, but Moshe says that if you have a case where it's only a suffix if Isser was made on the Kli, so then Moshe says you could also do Hagol B'Sha'ar Mashkim L'Chatchila. The whole thing to not use Hagol B'Sha'ar Mashkim is Chumrah. Minadin, you're allowed to do Sha'ar Mashkim. So Moshe says that if it's only a suffix, if the Kli was straight from the first place, you could do Hagol B'Sha'ar Mashkim. Okay. Now, another thing that we saw, which is not related to us, is that Milu V'Iru, this din is about Hagolah. Milu V'Iru, we saw you can do with Sha'ar Mashkim. People didn't argue about that. We talked about once before that you could do Milu V'Iru with Sha'ar Mashkim on the condition that you don't use the same type of mashke that the bli went in with. The bli went in with alcohol, don't use alcohol. If it went in with vinegar, don't use vinegar. That's what we had once before from Rishach. Okay. Now, last thing we have to do is, what are Sha'ar Mashkim? Okay, well, we know water is not Sha'ar Mashkim. What else? So we saw that so far wine and wine diluted with water and milk were examples we saw of Sha'ar Mashkim. The Mishnah says that also if you have water mixed with soap, that's also considered Sha'ar Mashkim. Okay, that doesn't say in the Ramah. That's water mixed with soap. The Ramah stuck in another case. If you have blias coming out of a kli till it clouds up, or does something to the water, that's also Sha'ar Mashkim. And the Mishnah says that if you have water mixed with soap, that's also considered Sha'ar Mashkim. We mentioned a few weeks ago that contemporary person has said that if the soap that you mix in doesn't change the color of the water, or doesn't change the texture of the water, I mean, it's just looks like plain clear water, and there's no noticeable difference, there are many people who have said that that's not considered Sha'ar Mashkim, which is very negated to us. It has to be not what Dayan Weiss is talking about, because he says he's talking about putting caustic in, and when you put in caustic, maybe I don't think that it changes the color and the texture of the water. It just looks like plain water. They put in such a small amount. Or you put in districts for sure. These kind of things in the small amount is able to be has effect, which again to us makes it less time of gam. But l'chayre doesn't change the color of the water. So the Mishaburu's water with soap, I don't know exactly what kind of soap he had, but his soap was more like you think of like washing dishes kind of soap, that it gets all bubbly or colorful or thicker. Like that. Okay, now. There's another thing. The last thing we have to do is that Moshe brings, in a different tshuva, brings that the Ran who's talking about this din, he's talking about the Rajba and the Ramban, and he says maybe the machlokes, the Ramban and the Rajba is dafka by yayin and water mixed with water, yayin, mosul, maybe milk, certain kinds of things like that. He says, but if you would have his examples are, I shouldn't say milk. I spoke too quickly. He says if you have shemen, shuman or cholov, then maybe even the Rajba would agree that you can't use that. And maybe the Ramban and the Rajba are only arguing about liquids that I'm making up a word now, that they're thinner, that they're less viscous, like wine, that's more watery, and that's the machlokes that those things could be used in it. He says, but maybe the Rajba would be moida that you can't use thicker liquids, like oil or fat, those are the things that thicker, and he uses cholov also. He's saying cholov because it has to do with the Gemara there. Okay, in Kolbas, it has to do with cholov. So he says also maybe those cannot be. Maybe the Rajba would be moed. That's what the Ran mentions such a thing. And then he says this. Maybe I have to rephrase it. Maybe shemen and shuman and cholov are worse than wine, and maybe the Rajba is moed by shemen and cholov that you can't use it for hagol. Okay, and he doesn't. Maybe the Rajba is moed to the Ramban that shemen and cholov can't be used for hagol. So Ramban says you can't use even more. Maybe he's moida that shemen and cholov you can't use for also. So Moshe in the Dai, how come he doesn't say shuman when he repeats it? He doesn't say shuman. He says shemen and cholov. At the beginning he said shemen, shuman, and cholov, and at the end he says shemen and cholov. So Moshe says is because maybe the whole we don't even pass like this round because the Ramah says you can use any mashka. He doesn't say only certain ones and not other ones. Completely any mashka is mutter b'diavad. He says, but maybe everyone agrees that something that's not liquid at room temperature, like shuman, animal fat, which is not liquid at room temperature, everyone agrees, not what the Ran says, maybe the Rajba is moed by thicker liquid, like oil. But Rav Moshe is saying, and even though we don't pass like that Rajba, we don't pass like that Ran, maybe everyone is moed, that if you have something that's not a liquid at room temperature, that can't be used for hagol, because hagol has to do with a mashke. The Ramah is even saying you could mahani the whole mashke, and if you have animal fat's not a mashke, it's temporarily a mashke because you're trying to hagol with it, but it's not really a mashke, and therefore Rav Moshe says he's talking about doing hagol with margin, okay, which in the way he's doing the hagol, it's liquefied margin. Okay, it's not margin when you're doing the hagol at 212 degrees. It's not margin. Okay, so Rav Moshe says that you cannot use a liquid which happens to be a liquid now, but it's really a solid room temperature. You can't use that for hagol. It's not even Sha'ar Mashkim. Okay, it's even lower than Sha'ar Mashkim. Doesn't work with the evidence. Doesn't work according to the mechaber. Doesn't work anything. Okay, and I'm not sure why no one mentions this thing, but that's Rav Moshe says you can't do that. Okay, so that's most famous. Most people don't try to kasher with margin. Okay, but it's most famous in kashering chocolate companies. Okay, that chocolate companies don't want to have water on their equipment, particularly in the countries they don't want to have water. So people want to kasher with cocoa butter or with cocoa liquor or chocolate or whatever. They use some other kind of liquid, chocolate liquid product, and they want to kasher with that. So one question is that Sha'ar Mashkim. So the first time was that Sha'ar Mashkim, and this is where Rabbi Shefter would say is, and it's not shasel kak to the other dummy for people to have power for chocolate. So the chocolate will be milk. Why is that he doesn't consider that shasel kak to the other dummy? So he doesn't consider that either to be. So you wait. You have other chocolate. No, not that he doesn't take halak seriously. He doesn't, But his other time is he says then you could argue about that whether it is or is not a shasel kak. You could argue about that. He says, but chocolate is of course a solid at room temperature. He says so you can't do hagol with it because not just because it's Sha'ar Mashkim, because it's not a mashke altogether. So you can't do hagol with that thing.
Now, I'm trying to picture this. The kashering with chocolate. Are they cleaning out the thing to get down to the bottom, to the middle of the keli, and then putting in chocolate? If they're doing all that every day, it's not so far off from using water.
Okay, so and the answer is
I don't believe
you're right. You're right, and you're right. You're right is as follows. The ikar complaint that they have about using water is in the conscious. And they're not talking about like the depositors and like later on equipment. That they'll clean and they kasher with water. The problem is more in the more like, further back up the line of the system. And those, it turns out that their hakpazah is not that the kalim can't be touched with water. It's not like they're going to rust if they touch them with water. The hakpazah is that if even the tiniest amount of water gets into the chocolate, it ruins the chocolate. Okay, the problem is you can do whatever you want to put water in. The problem is, but there's going to be water left over. So really, it's not that you can't kasher it. It's just that if you kasher it, you're going to have to put a lot of effort and a lot of time into drying the thing out. So you'll have to spend a week afterwards scrubbing it with a paper towel to get it dry. Okay, it's not that the keli can't handle water that you say, oh gosh, I have to do something else. It's that the kli can handle water, just the chocolate can't handle water. So you have to make tremendous efforts to get the water out afterwards. I'm not trying to make light of those efforts, but the efforts mean is that it's a matter of, in order to become parif, there is a way to do it. It's not impossible. There is a way to do it. It just takes a long time. And there were companies who actually did it, who went through the effort, made themselves parif alliance by doing this, but not using new equipment, by kashering with water and then just waiting it out. You're just cleaning it and drying it in air drying it in paper towels or whatever they had to do to get the thing clean. Okay.
I don't see how you're addressing my question.
So you're saying
those that want to be make of use chocolate.
Right, so this equipment, things like conscious don't get dirty. They are clean. They I shouldn't say they don't get dirty. They run all the time. Okay, but they can be cleaned. Their sorry is not to clean it. You heat it up and you can. It's not like the later equipment that is dirty, like 12 years worth of chocolate. These stuff are clean. They're when you look at it, they always run at warm or hot temperatures, and they're clean. They don't have deposits on them. The shaila is with the water. They don't want to put water on it, not because they can't get it clean, because they don't want to have water left. And in fact, there is a way to get around it. Okay. And one more case. This is not as straightforward. As Rabbi Shafta also said, a person wanted to kasher with tomato paste. Okay, Rabbi Shafta also thought that's the same kind of thing. Now that's not a solid at room temperature. I mean, it's not anything. He just didn't think it was a mashk altogether. Tomato paste, not tomato juice. Even though it says in the tomato juice, I went back to him and showed it to him, and he said no, it should say tomato paste. Okay, it says tomato paste. Is not a liquid. Okay, he said that's not a liquid. It's not a mashke. It's a fruit. Okay, so you're trying to kasher with the fruit. Ramosh is saying is you can't kasher with something that's a solid room temperature, but today is a liquid. Okay, but tomato paste is not a liquid altogether. Just food, just ground up tomatoes. So he also held that that's not considered even Sha'ar Mashkim to say that. But yeah, but you say if you kasher with Sha'ar Mashkim.